We live in a time when there's a lot of, to use a biblical expression, a lot of wailing and gnashing of teeth about the state of politics. It's occurring in all of our countries. It's occurring in Great Britain, it's occurring in Australia, it's occurring particularly in the United States as we face an extraordinary presidential election where the level of disenchantment with the two major candidates is quite unparalleled. And in the shadow of this great man, Edmund Burke, and conscious of the award that I've been given, I could perhaps briefly reflect on the relevance of some of the things that Burke said through his career on the state of politics. It is true that the new swear word of the political commentariat is populism. If you're not happy with something, then it's a result of populism having won the day. And I can understand that. It's easy to run a populist campaign, but it's also easy to lose sight of the fact that we've always had populism. There have always been people who are unhappy with the impact of particular political decisions on their lives or on their community. And it's always more likely that that will be the case in the wake of more difficult world economic circumstances. And I think as we wail and gnash our teeth about what we see as populism around the world at the present time, we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that it has come on the heels of a period of time when, between, I suppose, the early 2000s through, or even earlier than that, through to the global financial crisis, many of the governments and many of the communities of the Western world were pushing against an open door when it came to economic expansion and economic activity. And it's also easy to lose sight of the tremendous gains that globalisation and competitive capitalism have brought to the world, not least the poor of the world. I often hear those on the left saying the great moral challenge of our age is climate change. I think that's nonsense. It's not the great moral challenge of our age. The great moral challenge of our age remains as it has been for many ages, and that is the removal through fair means of free market-based growth, the gap between the rich and the poor. That's the great moral challenge, and that is the methodology by which that gap should be closed, not by state ownership and redistribution, but rather by the fruits of competitive capitalism and globalisation. We should never cease to remind the world and remind our electorates of what globalisation and what competitive capitalism has done. The hundreds of millions of people lifted from absolute poverty in many parts of Asia and South America, and now increasingly it's beginning to occur in the continent of Africa. That is the great success story of the last several decades. And whenever I hear the voices of criticism of globalisation and open trade, and it distresses me immensely that both of the candidates in the United States appear to have turned their backs on the Trans-Pacific Trade Partnership, something that would involve the economies of 60% of the world. And the United States has been so often the standard bearer, the great clarion crier when it comes to trade expansion and trade growth. We should never, let me say again, lose sight of what globalisation and competitive capitalism has done for the poor of the world. Edmund Burke's life, of course, reminds us, as does his example as a Member of Parliament, that politics above everything else is a battle of ideas. It is not a public relations contest. And when I think of those towering figures of world conservatism, Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, you are instantaneously reminded that theirs were lives committed to the great battle of ideas. When Ronald Reagan told his speechwriters that he was going to deliver a speech calling on Mr. Gorbachev to tear down that wall, they shuffled their feet. And many of his foreign affairs advisors said, well, maybe it's not quite the right time to say that. The wall had been up for a few years by then. And it was erected in 1962, if my memory serves me correctly. But he went ahead and he did it. And he was an exemplar of a person who understood that at crucial moments in the history of his own nation and of the world, there was a time to stand against any tide of nervous public opinion in favour of principle. And as far as he was concerned, there was a great principle involved. And we all know as a consequence, not just of that, but of a special partnership forged between him and Margaret Thatcher, with a magnificent moral contribution of leadership from Pope John Paul II, that great product of the proud Polish state. We saw eventually the collapse of the Soviet Union. And in your own country, of course, the example of Margaret Thatcher stands with equal height. There was never any doubt that she saw politics as a battle of values and ideas. There was never any doubt what her values and what her ideas were. She wasn't always right. Nobody in politics is, but she got the big things right. And the successful political leaders of the world are those that get the big things right. Political leaders who try as hard as they can never to make a mistake will never get any big things right, because in the end it's getting the big things right that really matter. Burke also reminded us of the importance, and Jesse did tonight, of the political party as a core unit of advancement and activity. And we shouldn't, in reflecting on that, feel in any way complacent about the state of party politics around the Western world. Political movements today are not the mass movements they were of 40 or 50 years ago. Their memberships are no longer as representative of the generality of the people who vote for them as they used to be. They are far more prone to falling into the hands of factional operators than used to be the case. And it's very important that we understand that we are dealing with an electorate that is more prone to approaches not based on principle, but based on what I regard as the insidious rise of identity politics. Identity politics whereby you seek to gather the support of a group based on what that group has in common, not the support of that group for a common principle which might gain acceptance throughout the entire community. That is not a healthy development. I think it's also important to remind ourselves, and this is perhaps the one comment that I might make on your recent referendum on membership of the European Union, is that despite what we are frequently told by many, we still live in a world of the nation state. It is still a Westphalian world. It is still a world where the key organising principle of world affairs is relations between nations. And that is not a call to move away from international cooperation. It is simply a recognition of what the nation-state can achieve. And as I've moved around the region in which my own country is geographically located, I'm constantly reminded of the great admiration held for Lee Kuan Yew, the founder of the state of Singapore. And he is a classic modern example of somebody who recognised the power of the nation-state and his ability to build this wonderful country from so little and in such adverse circumstances. Finally, I think Burke would want us tonight to understand how fundamental to the sort of society he helped bequeath to this and other generations is the importance of defending free speech. I've often argued that you don't need, and remains my very passionate view, a Bill of Rights. Bills of Rights restrict rights, they don't expand them. If you have a robust parliamentary system, if you have a completely free media and you have an incorruptible judiciary, you've got the elements of a free society, you've got the basics. But we do live in an age where there's a creeping political correctness which is restricting free speech. I can think of two quite egregious examples of that, one in my own country and one in yours. Recently, a well-known cartoonist in the Australian magazine, Bill Leake, published a brilliant cartoon which depicted an Aboriginal policeman holding an Aboriginal boy and confronting the father of that boy and saying to the father, "It's about time you taught him about personal responsibility." And the father, holding a can of beer, said, "Righto, what's his name then?" It was a brilliant, perceptive cartoon that made the point, and I think it was a point that was applauded around the community, not just in relation to the Aboriginal community where failed fatherhood is a problem, but to other communities where failed fatherhood is also a serious problem. And yet, for his pains, this man and his magazine is being dragged before the Human Rights Commission in Australia and asked to explain. That is a terrible assault on free speech. Terrible assault on free speech. And Burke would be appalled, rightly so. And I think Burke would be appalled about what I might loosely call the baker's case in Northern Ireland, where a baker who has a view about same-sex marriage, which he's entitled to have, which other people don't have, but that's not the point. The point is he gets prosecuted for refusing to place a statement on the icing of a cake that does not reflect his own personal view. And the man ends up being dragged before the courts. I don't condemn the judge. The judge was enforcing his interpretation of the law. But if we really live in the shadow of Edmund Burke and we revere him and we value his principles, then surely we would look at those two examples of the way in which a creeping political correctness, the manner by which anti-discrimination laws have been carried to almost demented lengths, and we would express our concern and our alarm at those developments. Tonight is a special occasion for me, and I know I speak for Jeanette in saying how moved we are to see so many old friends in the room, in the capital of a nation for which I have deep affection and which has contributed so much to the things that we hold dear and through the centuries has stood against tyranny, supported always by my own country and by our friends in other parts of the world, particularly across the Atlantic. And to say to all of you that the legacy of Burke is a precious one. It informs, as Daniel said, my own party, which I've always described as a broad church, of classical liberals and conservatives. And it's a great heritage, and you have all, in different ways, fought to defend it. I thank you for that, and in accepting this award with great gratitude, I want to salute Daniel and you, Jan, and your friends for the way in which you carry the torch for the right kind of conservatism, of that great blend of preserving what is good until it is proved bad, and preserving a fundamental belief in the importance of individuals, the need to limit the role of government, a faith in markets, and a belief in the right of people to accumulate private property, to make money, to be successful in life, providing you do it honestly and you pay through taxation your due contribution to caring for those in the community who, through no fault of their own, have fallen through the cracks. I know everybody in this room stands for that kind of society, and to the extent that I have helped in my own political life to build it in my own country, I am grateful to have had the opportunity, and I warmly thank you for the honour you've done for me tonight. Thank you.